We're also obviously responsible for, managing the GitHub repositories and other such, chore things that you need a more formal right for. But that doesn't mean that you can't manage pull requests and raise pull requests. You can be on the working group to do that. You don't need to be TSC member.
I actually didn't know that. So the TSC is more like a legal requirement to sign off things that need legal votes. But really the working groups are the things that do the actual work.
Absolutely. In fact, we make it a point that the GraphQL TSC monthly meetup is the GraphQL working group monthly meetup. Technically, we're meant to have like a small bit at the beginning, but there's very, very rarely any actual TSC business. So generally we just skip over it. But there was, mentions of it when it came to, for example, recently the TSC duration that you serve is a calendar year. So that's coming to the end for some folks, including myself. And then we've opened nominations for people to nominate themselves. Obviously, we're recording now in December. So those nominations have been collected. The remaining TSC that are not at the end of their term will be taking a vote on that. And then in January, we should find out who the next 5 TSC members will be, which may well be us again that were previous there, maybe new people. Who knows? It'd be interesting to find out.
That's super exciting. And you mentioned working groups. Is there multiple working groups? Is there one working group?
Great question. So there is the GraphQL specification working group, which works on the spec. That is the main working group because as we both discussed, the spec is really the core of GraphQL. We also have the reference implementation, and we've got Express GraphQL and a bunch of other projects, Graphical. But these are all useful projects. GraphQL.js is the reference implementation, but GraphQL is implemented in, I think, over 30 different programming languages now. But the spec is shared. There's not different versions of the spec. Yeah. There is one spec. So the spec working group is the core. The spec working group can spin out sub-working groups for particular spec-related purposes. So we had one for input unions at one point, and we have some for other purposes. But there are also working groups for the various projects. So there's a GraphQL over HTTP working group, for example, to help us formalize what we've all been doing for the last 6 years anyway, but try and actually have a concrete spec that says, here is exactly how you should do GraphQL over HTTP. I think that's one of the things that people don't really realize about GraphQL is it doesn't actually in itself relate to HTTP at all. It is effectively, GraphQL is a function call, really. You give it a document and some variables and you expect back a response, but it doesn't matter whether that's done over HTTP or WebSockets or, over the phone, over fax, who cares? It doesn't really matter to GraphQL itself, but it obviously matters to the ecosystem. But there's also ones for Graphical, the IDE that we have, and GraphQL.js itself. Lots of working groups with lots of different people involved, all helping to contribute to making GraphQL better.
That's fantastic to know. I have one more follow-up question, which is, let's say that I am listening to this and I am I have a really good idea on how to make GraphQL better. Where would I go? What would that process look like, right? If I'm I have an idea on how to make this better, what would the steps be for me to actually get that, assuming it's really a good idea and everyone else agrees, which I would assume is the most difficult part here. How would I actually get it into GraphQL? And then the spec, but also the reference implementation and anywhere else it needs to be.
Let's assume that this is a fundamental change to GraphQL that involves a change to the GraphQL spec. Because if you want to make a change to, for example, Graphical, the GraphQL IDE, then you would just get involved with that repository like you would with any other open source repository. So assuming that this is a change that needs a change to the GraphQL spec, there's been a lot of them. You would start by writing down what is it that you are trying, we try and focus on what's the problem that's being solved rather than what's the solution. So don't start with the solution, start with the problem. There's a number of ways you can do it. If you've already got a solution in mind and you can say, here's the problem, here's the solution I'm proposing, or you can just say, here's the problem and I want to talk about it. File that somewhere, whether it be a pull request to the GraphQL spec itself, whether it just be an issue. We also have the GraphQL working group repository where we have an RFCs folder, request for comments, where you can file a document there that details what you care about. This is a brilliant way to start, by the way. We generally say that whatever you're doing is a request for comments. So just filing it as a document in that repository, which has a very, very low barrier to merging. You raise a document against it, someone will check that it makes sense. Not necessarily that they want it to be in GraphQL, but they're just like, that it's a reasonable request, and then it will get merged. Then you would also add yourself to the GraphQL working group agenda for one of the upcoming agendas. So the next one's in January at the moment, for example. You just put your name in there, Benjie Gillam, GraphQL, Chandler's Ford UK, and then you put your topic, like I want to, tagged type for doing input unions or something like that. Put an estimate of the amount of time. So many people say 5 minutes, and it's never 5 minutes. So then someone like me will come along and say, let's up that to 15. And then that gets merged, and then you just turn up at the next working group. There is actually an extra step, which is you must agree to the contributor agreement. But that's all sort of bot-led. There's a bot that says, you've not signed this. Here's how you go and do it. You go and do it. You sign, you put your name on the thing, press sign. It then should automatically detect that. You merge it, or someone like me would merge it. And then you, attend, discuss, and then we go from there. There's a number of stages involved. So the stage 0, I think it is like the straw man. So that's what you would generally raise. Like, I think this thing sucks. Like, everything being nullable by default is great for error handling, but actually it makes my client code really, really messy. I want to introduce the ability to say, throw an error if this field is null. So now I don't need to deal with that null. This is the change that I want. This is the problem I have. What do you think, folks? And people will then look at that and they'll say, yeah, we felt that problem too. Or no, this seems very specific to your use case, or whatever. Or have you considered doing it with a directive, or other such things? You'll get feedback, and that will then help guide where you go next. And then the aim would be to move it up to stage 1 at a later agenda, and then to move it to stage 2 at a later agenda, and so on until it's stage 4, gets merged, and then ships out with the next release of GraphQL.